The distress signal came in at 0317 hours, and it was already 6 hours old by the time it reached me. I was the only one awake on the station. The relay post on the edge of the contested fringe was not the kind of place that kept a full night crew. There were 4 of us assigned here, and the other 3 had long since stopped pretending that anything interesting would ever happen. They slept through their shifts, rotated their watch duties with the minimum effort required, and counted the days until their reassignment. I had been here 11 months. I had 41 days left. I almost missed the signal entirely. It came in fragmented, the kind of data that arrives in pieces when a ship's transmitter has been partially destroyed. The identifier code belonged to a civilian freighter called the Argent Cross, registered out of the colony at Kepler Station 4. Crew of 11. Licensed to carry agricultural equipment and medical supplies along the outer trade routes. It was not a military vessel. It was not a strategic target. It was a cargo ship crewed by ordinary people doing ordinary work in a part of the galaxy that everyone else had decided was not worth paying attention to. I pulled the full transmission log and started piecing it together. What I found made me sit very still for a long time. The Argent Cross had been boarded. Not by pirates, not by opportunistic raiders looking for a quick theft. The attack was systematic. The ship's engine room had been disabled first, precisely, in a way that suggested foreknowledge of the vessel's design. The crew had attempted to seal the cargo hold and send the distress signal simultaneously. They had managed the signal. They had not managed the seal. 11 people. I read the crew manifest twice because I could not stop myself from doing it. The captain's name was Frank Alderton. He had worked the outer routes for 22 years. There was a ship's engineer named Carol Vane, and a young navigator who had logged his first outer route passage only 3 months before this one. His name was Pete Simmons, and he was 24 years old. I set the manifest down and looked at the star map on the wall of the station's operations room. The signal had come from Grid Sector 7, which put the attack somewhere in the outer fringe about 9 light hours from my position. By the time the signal reached me, whatever had happened was long finished. Whoever had done this was already gone, but they had left something behind. Buried inside the data fragments from the Argent Cross was a secondary signal, a narrowband transmission that had been running on a frequency the freighter's systems would not normally capture. It was not meant for me. It was not meant for any human receiver. It was communication between the attackers and someone else, picked up by accident when the Argent Cross's damaged systems began broadcasting on a wider spectrum during the final moments of the assault. I spent 2 hours decoding it, using the translation software we kept on the station for diplomatic processing. The language was Vrethkai. I knew the name, the way you know the name of a distant country you have never visited. The Vrethkai Syndicate had emerged as a significant power in the outer fringe over the past decade, expanding their territory with speed and an absolute certainty that the rest of the galaxy would accommodate them. They had never directly engaged a human vessel before. The transmission was short. It said, in the clipped, formal dialect of Vrethkai military communication, the route is clear. The humans will not respond. They never do. I read that line 4 times. Then I began searching the station's archive database, which was one of the things I had been doing with my 11 months of boredom. The archive was old. It connected to the broader Galactic Council records through a relay node that most people in my position never bothered to access, because most people in my position spent their off hours watching entertainment feeds and complaining about the food. I had been reading history. What I found that night changed the shape of everything I thought I understood. The archive contained, buried under 4 centuries of diplomatic correspondence and trade agreements and boundary negotiations, a single document that was not a treaty and not a formal declaration. It was a warning. It had been issued by the Galactic Council 412 years ago and distributed to every member species. It was written in 11 languages, and a human translation of the title read, simply, Rule 1. The content was not long. It said, do not engage the humans. This is not a request. This is not a treaty clause. This is the considered judgment of this council, recorded here as permanent guidance, based on the events of Stardate reference 774 Alpha. Any species, faction, syndicate, or governing body that initiates a direct armed engagement with human forces or human civilians does, so with the full understanding that this council will not intervene in what follows. You have been warned. There was no elaboration. There was no list of consequences, no description of what had happened on Stardate reference 774 Alpha. Just that single paragraph, and below it, the signatures of 41 council representatives. I went looking for Stardate reference 774 Alpha. It took me another hour to find it, in a sub-archive that appeared to have been accessed only a handful of times since it was filed. 412 years ago, a human exploration vessel called the Dauntless had been operating along what was then the outer edge of known space. A species called the Mavari, now long absorbed into larger galactic coalitions, had decided to use the vessel as a demonstration of their military capability. The Dauntless was one ship. The Mavari sent a war fleet of 22 vessels. The Dauntless destroyed all 22 of them, not through superior firepower. The Dauntless was a small ship with standard armaments. It destroyed 22 Mavari warships through what the archive described, in dry council language, as unconventional tactical application. The surviving Mavari had filed a diplomatic protest with the Galactic Council. They wanted reparations. They wanted an apology. They wanted the humans to acknowledge what they had done. The human response to the diplomatic protest was recorded in the archive as a single short message, received and noted. That was all, nothing more. The Galactic Council, after observing this exchange, had drafted Rule 1 and distributed it to every member species within the year. The Mavari, for their part, had never engaged a human vessel again. I sat back in my chair in the small, cold operations room of a relay station on the edge of nowhere, with 400 years of history sitting in my hands, and I understood for the first time why the rest of the galaxy treated humanity the way it did. Not with contempt, not with indifference, with the careful, deliberate neutrality of people who have been told clearly and once not to provoke the animal. The Vrethkai Syndicate was a young power. They had risen fast, in the outer fringe, in a region where the Galactic Council's oldest records were not widely circulated. They had expanded aggressively for 10 years without facing any consequence that slowed them down. They had looked at humanity and seen a species that did not patrol these borders heavily, did not issue threats, did not rattle weapons at passing ships. They had decided this meant we were not dangerous. They had never read Rule 1. I composed my report to Earth Command with the same care I would have given to something I knew would be read carefully by people who mattered. I included everything: the freighter attack, the crew manifest, the intercepted Vrethkai transmission, the archive document. I attached the original Rule 1 text. I flagged the report as urgent priority and sent it on the fastest relay path available. Then I waited. The reply came 14 hours later. It was not from a junior communications officer. The sender was listed as Strategic Command, which meant someone very senior had read what I sent and decided to respond personally. The message was 6 words long. It said, "Confirm casualties, then do nothing. Wait." I read it 3 times, the way I had read everything that night, looking for more meaning than the words contained on the surface. But those 6 words were exactly what they appeared to be. Not a bureaucratic deflection, not a stalling tactic, not evidence that no one was paying attention. I had spent the last few hours reading 400 years of human history as seen through the lens of species who had watched us carefully from a safe distance. I understood now that those 6 words were not an instruction to be passive. They were signal. Earth Command was not surprised. They were not scrambling. There was no alarm in those 6 words, no urgency, no panic. The tone of a Strategic Command message that reads "confirm casualties" and then "do nothing" wait is not the tone of an organization that has been caught off guard. It is the tone of an organization that has already begun moving and does not need the person in the field to do anything except stay out of the way. I confirmed the casualties. I listed all 11 names. Then I did nothing. I waited. The night shift turned into the day shift, and the day shift turned into another night, and my 3 colleagues went about their routines without knowing that the galaxy had just shifted slightly under all of our feet. I did not tell them what I had found. Not because I was keeping secrets, but because the message from Strategic Command had been addressed to me alone, and I had been in uniform long enough to understand what that meant. I spent those days reading the archive, all of it that I could find. 400 years of careful distance, of species that gave humans generous trade terms and wide border clearances, and the particular kind of respect you extend to something you are afraid of without wanting to admit it. 400 years of a rule that had been followed without fail. Until 3 nights ago, when a Vrethkai commander had looked at a cargo route in the outer fringe and decided that the humans would not respond. They never do. I thought about Pete Simmons, 24 years old, 3 months on the outer routes. I thought about Frank Alderton, 22 years on the same roads, doing the same quiet work. The Vrethkai commander had been right about one thing. We had not responded yet. It was the part he had not understood. I wondered how long it would take him to learn the difference. The 6th week of silence was the hardest. Not for me, specifically, not in any way I could explain to someone who had not been watching the timeline stretch out across those days. For 6 weeks, Earth Command said nothing publicly. There was no statement released to the Galactic Council. There was no diplomatic note delivered to the Vrethkai Syndicate. There was no acknowledgement from any human official that the attack on the Argent Cross had even occurred. The galactic news networks, which monitored human communications channels with the dedication of people who found us endlessly fascinating and slightly unsettling, reported nothing because there was nothing to report. The Vrethkai Syndicate interpreted this as confirmation. I knew this because my intercept work at the relay station had expanded considerably since the night of the attack. Strategic Command had quietly upgraded my access level and increased the station's surveillance reach without announcing the change. What had previously been a backwater posting had become, without any change in my official duties or title, something closer to an intelligence station. I kept filing reports. No one told me to stop. In the 4th week, the Vrethkai began moving. Not obviously. Not in a way that would have read as escalation to someone not paying close attention. Their patrol vessels began extending their range into corridors that had previously been outside their operational area. Their supply routes shifted slightly, in ways that suggested repositioning rather than resupply. Their communication traffic increased on military band frequencies, which was the kind of thing that only became significant when you put it beside everything else. They were not preparing to attack again, not yet. They were expanding the boundaries of what they believed was safely theirs. At the start of the 5th week, I received a visit. A ship arrived at the relay station without advance notice, which was unusual. It was not a military vessel in any obvious way. It was registered as a survey craft, which was the kind of registration that meant almost nothing and was filed specifically because it meant almost nothing. The commander of the vessel was a woman named Diane Cole, and she arrived at my station with 2 crew members and a very small amount of luggage, which told me she did not intend to stay long. She sat down across from me in the operations room, accepted the coffee I offered without comment, and told me I was being reassigned. I asked where. She said the Resolute. I did not know the name. She passed me a data card, and I read the specs in silence. The Resolute was registered as a survey vessel. It had the whole profile of a survey vessel. It had the power readings and communication systems of a survey vessel. It was in every official record that could be checked by anyone with standard clearance, a survey vessel. It had the weapons load of a heavy cruiser. I looked up from the data card, and Diane Cole was watching me with the expression of someone who had explained this particular piece of information several times recently and found it mildly interesting to see each new person's reaction. I asked how many ships like the Resolute existed. She said 17. I asked where the others were. She said positioned. I did not ask position where, because I had already looked at the star map enough times in the past 5 weeks to have a reasonable answer to that question in my own head. 17 vessels, quietly repositioned across the fringe, in the empty spaces between Vrethkai patrol routes, in the survey corridors that no one monitored because survey vessels did not require monitoring. I thought about 6 weeks of silence and what you could accomplish in 6 weeks if you were not wasting any of it on announcements. Diane Cole finished her coffee, told me I would receive further detail once aboard, and left. She and her 2 crew members were back on their ship and gone within the hour. I packed what I needed and waited for my transport. The Resolute was larger than the relay station and quieter than any military vessel I had previously served on. Not the quiet of a ship at low power, but the quiet of a crew that had been selected carefully and had been at their work long enough that they no longer needed to fill space with unnecessary noise. The commander of the Resolute was a man named Alan Price, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had done difficult things in difficult places and made peace with all of it. He showed me to my station and told me my primary role was observation and translation. I would be monitoring Vrethkai communications and providing real-time interpretation. I would not need to fire anything, pilot anything, or make any decisions above my rank. He said this without condescension. It was simply useful information. I asked him when we expected to move. He said we were already moving. He was right. The Resolute had been in transit for 3 days before I boarded, drifting along a survey corridor that brought it steadily closer to the main Vrethkai operational zone in the fringe without triggering any of their patrol alerts. We were not hiding, exactly. A ship in a registered survey corridor running standard survey signatures did not need to hide. It was already invisible. It was in the second day of my time aboard the Resolute that the Vrethkai made their second move. The colony outpost at Beacon 6 had been established 8 years earlier as a way station for the outer routes, a refueling and resupply point with a small permanent population and a rotating crew of maintenance and medical staff. 312 people at last census. It was not a military installation. It had one defense array that was primarily designed to deter pirates and had never been tested against anything larger. The Vrethkai broadcast the attack. That was the part that stayed with me. The part one found myself turning over in those first hours after the signal came in. They did not simply conduct the assault. They transmitted it on an open channel, on a frequency they knew human relay networks would pick up and distribute. It was a message delivered in the language of action. We did this. We are showing you we did this, and you will still not respond. 312 people. I sat at my translation station and listened to Vrethkai military communication for the next 6 hours, and I built a picture in my head of what they believed was happening. They thought they had confirmed their original assessment. Humanity was watching. Humanity was not moving. Humanity was absorbing the provocation without reaction. Every hour that passed without a human response was, to them, another data point in the argument that we were not a threat. The resolution of this assumption arrived in my inbox at 0900 the following morning. It was from Alan Price. He had forwarded a message from Earth Strategic Command, and the message contained coordinates, timing windows, and target designations. I counted the designations twice. 73. Every known Vrethkai military installation in the fringe, every patrol staging point, every communication hub they used for military band traffic, every supply depot that supported their expanded patrol routes. 73 targets, with timing windows that showed they were all designated for simultaneous action. The 6 weeks of silence had not been hesitation. They had not been a failure of will or a gap in communication or bureaucratic delay. 6 weeks was how long it had taken to quietly move 17 ships into position, identify every target, calculate simultaneous approach vectors across 6 light years of space, and make sure that when the answer came, it was complete. We had not waited because we were afraid. We had waited because we were counting. On the 3rd day after I received the target list, a Vrethkai diplomatic shuttle requested permission to dock with the Resolute. Alan Price granted it without consulting anyone. I was in the operations room when the shuttle docked, and I was still there when the Vrethkai envoy came through the airlock. Her name was Sarah, according to the credentials she presented, and she was a 3rd-level diplomatic representative, which meant she had been sent to make an offer that her government believed we would find acceptable. She looked at me the way people look at furniture that happens to be occupying a space they need to use. She looked at Alan Price the way people look at someone they have already decided they understand. She presented the offer without preamble. The Vrethkai syndicate acknowledged the unfortunate incidents in the fringe. They were prepared to offer reparations for the cargo lost aboard the Argent Cross and to consider a trade framework that would include human routes in certain established corridors. In exchange, humanity would acknowledge the Vrethkai's right to operate freely within what they described as their natural sphere of expansion, which included, I noted, the grid sectors containing Beacon 6 and 7 other outposts. She delivered this the way you deliver a settlement, to someone who does not have the leverage to refuse it. Alan Price listened to the entire offer without moving. When she finished, he asked me if I had any translation questions. I said no. I had understood everything clearly. He nodded once, looked back at Sarah, and said that Earth Command would provide its own response in due time. Sarah waited for more. She was clearly expecting a counteroffer, a list of demands, a raised voice, something she could negotiate against. Alan Price simply looked at her. She said, "When can we expect this response?" He said, "Earth Command will let you know." She left 20 minutes later, and I watched the shuttle detach and move away into open space. I thought about the offer she had delivered, about the confidence in her voice when she talked about natural spheres of expansion, about the way she had described what happened at Beacon 6 as an unfortunate incident. I thought about 312 people. Alan Price came to stand beside me at the viewport. I said, "She thinks we're going to take the deal." He said, "She thought we already would have." I asked how long. He looked at his watch. He said, 61 hours. We didn't answer because we were angry. We didn't answer because we were counting. We had finished counting. The timing window opened at 0200, and the Resolute was already inside it. There was no announcement. Alan Price did not gather the crew and deliver a speech. There was no visible change in the ship's status, no alarm, no formal declaration of any kind. The crew of the Resolute had known for 48 hours what was going to happen and had spent that time preparing with the particular focus of people who had trained for something long enough that it no longer felt like anything except work. I was at my translation station. My job in the next several hours was to monitor Vrethkai communication channels and provide real-time interpretation to Alan Price and the tactical team. I had headphones, a display screen, and 2 cups of coffee that I did not drink. At 0212, the first Vrethkai installation in the target list went dark. It did not explode. It did not broadcast a distress signal. It simply stopped transmitting. One moment it was there on the communication grid, and the next moment it was not. The effect was so clean that for several seconds the Vrethkai monitoring systems appeared to be processing it as a technical fault rather than an attack. At 0214, 3 more installations went dark. At 0217, 11 more. I was watching the Vrethkai military communication network in real time, and I could see the moment their monitoring teams began to understand what was happening. The traffic shifted. Voices became faster. The disciplined language of routine military communication cracked along its edges, and something rawer came through. I translated as quickly as I could, feeding the relevant fragments to Alan Price in short bursts. "They're calling it a system failure," I said. "They think it's a cascade network error." Alan nodded without looking away from the tactical display. At 0223, 31 installations had gone dark. The Vrethkai home fleet, which had been on standard patrol rotation, was now being recalled. I could hear the orders going out, urgent and controlled, the voice of a commander trying to hold the shape of a plan that was no longer responding to his instructions. At 0231, all 73 targets were silent. 6 light years of Vrethkai military infrastructure had been removed from the communication grid in 19 minutes. There had been no warning, no declaration, no demand for surrender. There had been nothing that fit the shape of what the Vrethkai had expected from a human military response. They had expected battle lines. They had expected fleets squaring off in open space. They had expected the kind of conflict they had waged before against enemies who fought the way they fought. The Resolute had not gone near any of the 73 targets. Our mission was different. 3 hours before the timing window opened, while I had been sitting at my station drinking cold coffee and reading Vrethkai patrol logs, Alan Price had briefed the boarding team. Vrethkai High Commander Graf was commanding his forces from a mobile command vessel stationed at the edge of the primary operational zone. The vessel was fast and well defended and had 3 escort ships. The Resolute, running on its survey signatures in the corridor it had occupied for days, was already closer to Grath's position than any of his defensive systems had thought to account for. We were not there to destroy the command vessel. We were there to take Grath off it. The boarding action was not loud. The team was 8 people, led by a quiet lieutenant named Kara Wells, who had the particular economy of movement of someone who had done this before and understood that everything unnecessary was a liability. I was not part of the team. I sat at my station and listened to the Vrethkai communication traffic and translated what I heard and tried not to think too hard about what was happening on the other side of the airlock. Grath's personal security was 6 people, and they were good. I knew this because the action took longer than it should have, and because when the team came back through the airlock, Kara Wells had a cut above her left eye that had been sealed with emergency adhesive and was still dark at the edges, and 2 members of the team were not with her. I did not ask immediately. There was a sequence to these things, and the sequence had to run before anything else. Grath was secured in the forward holding compartment. Kara Wells delivered her status report to Alan Price and then went to the medical bay. Alan came to my station and told me, quietly, that we had lost 2 people in the boarding. Their names were Owen Banks and Louise Ferry. Owen had been a weapons specialist and had joined the Resolute 6 months ago. Louise had been with Alan Price for 3 years and had served 2 previous tours in the French. I wrote their names in my log because I did not know what else to do with the weight of them. 2 hours later, Alan Price took me with him to the holding compartment. Grath was not what I had expected, though I was not entirely sure what I had expected. He was compact, the way Vrethkai commanders often appeared in intelligence files, with the bearing of someone who had never had a reason to be uncertain about his place in any room. He looked at Alan Price with the expression of someone who had been through negotiations before and had a clear idea of how they worked. He looked at me the way Sarah had looked at me on the day of her visit. Like furniture, Alan Price sat down across from him and was quiet for a long time. Grath appeared to find the silence irritating rather than threatening. Eventually he said, in the clipped Vrethkai trade tongue that most species in the fringe use for interspecies communication, that he wished to speak to a senior representative. He said this to Alan Price. Alan Price said, in the same language, "You are speaking to one." Grath said he assumed there was a demand to be made, a negotiation to be had, some framework in which the situation would resolve itself into an outcome both parties could live with. He said it with the certainty of someone who had seen conflict used as leverage many times and understood how the cycle ran. Alan Price said, "Tell me what led you to conduct the operations you conducted." Grath said, "Business. Expansion. The outer routes are commercially valuable." Alan Price said, "You believed we would not respond." Grath said, "You had not responded." This was an accurate assessment at the time. Alan Price was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to read you something." He looked at me. I took out the data card I had been carrying since the night at the relay station with the archive text I had retrieved 400 years deep, and I read Grath the text of Rule 1. I read it in Vrethkai, trade tongue, slowly and clearly, the way you read something to someone you want to be certain has understood every word. Grath's expression did not change while I was reading, but when I finished, there was something different in the room, something that had not been there before. He said, "That document is 4 centuries old." Alan Price said, "Yes." Grath said, "The Vrethkai Syndicate did not exist 4 centuries ago. This rule was not written for us." Alan Price said, "It was written for everyone." Grath was quiet then for the first time since we had sat down with him. Alan Price did not fill the silence. I did not fill the silence. "Will it sit?" Grath said, "What is the demand? Territory? Tribute?" Alan Price said, "There is no demand. I told you that. We are here because Earth Command needed to understand how this happened. You are here to explain it." Grath looked at him for a long time. I could see him trying to find the shape of what was happening, the familiar structure of negotiation, the framework he knew how to move within. It was not there. There was a human commander sitting across from him without anger, without a list of conditions, without anything that fit the pattern of how conflicts were supposed to resolve. What had been done to 73 Vrethkai installations in 19 minutes was still being processed by Vrethkai Command. The home fleet was still scrambling. The mobile command vessel that Graf had been taken from was broadcasting a request for instruction that no one was answering because the communication hubs it normally used were silent. Graf kept waiting for the threat that would clarify the situation. I watched his face, and I saw the moment he understood that there was not going to be one. That was the part that finally broke his composure. Not the boarding, not the holding compartment, not the loss of his command. The silence where the threat should have been. I had been in the Galactic Council chambers once before, years ago, as part of a junior diplomatic support team for a trade boundary negotiation. I remember them as very large and very cold, with a particular acoustic quality of a room that has been designed to carry every voice equally to every corner. Every seat was occupied, and every species in that room was paying very close attention. I stood behind Alan Price at the human delegation table and watched them watch us. There were 11 species present, represented at various seniority levels. The Vrethkai had sent a delegation of 4, none of whom held a title above second-tier diplomatic rank. I had been briefed on this before we arrived and understood what it meant. The Vrethkai leadership was, as of 3 weeks after the fringe operations, conducting most of its senior functions from locations that were not widely publicized. They had not declared this. They had simply become harder to find. The council session had been called at the request of 7 member species, on the grounds that the human military operations in the fringe constituted a breach of galactic peace norms and required formal council review. The document calling for the session used the phrase disproportionate response 4 times. I had counted. Alan Price had asked me to deliver Earth's formal statement. I had not slept much in the nights leading up to it, not because I was nervous about speaking in the chamber, but because I had been working on the statement for 2 weeks and it had gone through 16 drafts. Each draft got shorter. The final version was not long. I had learned, in the months since the Argent Cross, that the right things said plainly were more powerful than anything decorated with urgency or emotion. When the council chair recognized the human delegation, I stood. I did not begin with a claim or a defense or a counterargument. I began with names. I read the names of the 11 crew of the Argent Cross. I read their names and their roles and their years of service on the outer routes. Frank Alderton had logged more than 90,000 hours on routes that nobody else wanted. Pete Simmons had been 24 years old. I did not explain why I was reading the names. I let the room understand on its own. Then I read the names of the people who had been at Beacon 6 at the time of the second Vrethkai operation. All 312 of them. I had the list. I had prepared it carefully. It took 14 minutes to read, and the council chamber was silent for all 14 of those minutes. When I finished, I set the list down and looked at the room. I said, Earth Command has conducted a review of the events in the contested fringe over the past 3 months. Our findings are as follows. I laid it out chronologically. The attack on the Argent Cross. The intercepted transmission that confirmed the attackers were Vrethkai military. The 6 weeks of silence in which Earth Command identified the full scope of Vrethkai military activity in the fringe. The second attack on Beacon 6, which was broadcast openly. Earth's response, which was proportional to the infrastructure used to conduct and support both attacks. I said, we have not occupied any Vrethkai territory. We have not made any territorial claim. We have not issued any demand. We asked for an explanation, and we received Commander Grath's account, which is on record with Earth Command and available to this council upon formal request. Then I read Rule 1, not as a justification, not as a defense, simply as context. I read it the same way I had read it to Grath in the holding compartment, slowly and clearly, and then I set it down. I said, Earth asks this council one question. We ask it without anger and without condition. The question is this: do you believe the rule has been followed? I sat down. The silence lasted long enough that several delegates shifted in their seats. The council chair opened the floor to the Vrethkai delegation. The senior Vrethkai representative, a man named Cole by the interspecies name he had registered for council functions, stood and delivered a prepared statement that covered a great deal of ground. He said the fringe operations had been commercial in nature, not military. He said the Argent Cross incident had resulted from a misidentification. He said the Beacon 6 operation had been conducted against an installation with defense capabilities, which he characterized as making it a military target. The defense array at Beacon 6 had been designed to deter pirates. I did not say this. I did not need to. 3 other species representatives spoke, each in careful diplomatic language, each trying to find a position that neither endorsed the Vrethkai actions nor was read as supportive of humanity's response. It was exactly the kind of careful navigation I had been watching alien diplomacy perform around humanity for the 400 years of archive I had spent months reading. They were all very careful not to take a side, not because they did not have opinions, but because they understood something that the Vrethkai had apparently not understood, which was that the side you chose in a situation like this had consequences. Then the Thalvari representative spoke. The Thalvari were the oldest species in the chamber. Their current council representative was a woman who had held the posting for 30 years and was believed to be somewhere in the vicinity of 140 years old. She spoke quietly and without urgency, and the acoustics of the chamber carried every word. She said, "My species wrote Rule 1. We wrote it after reviewing the events of Stardate Reference 774 Alpha, and we circulated it to every member of the council with the sincere hope that no one would ever need to invoke it. It was not written as a threat. It was written as a description of fact. It was our best effort for centuries ago to prevent something exactly like what has occurred in the contested fringe." She paused. She said, "We failed in our duty by allowing Rule 1 to become a historical footnote. We failed to ensure that newer members of this council, species that emerged after its original distribution, were made aware of its existence and its basis. We extend our formal apology to Earth Command for that failure." Then she looked at me. She said, "Commander Vorn, we are sorry that it came to this." I thanked her. It was not the easiest thing I have ever said. Not because it was difficult to be gracious, but because behind the graciousness was the 14 minutes of names and the weight of Owen Banks and Louise Ferry and the sound of Cara Wells coming back through the airlock with her face sealed shut over a cut she had not mentioned since it happened. The Vrethkai delegation demanded the immediate return of High Commander Grath. I confirmed that Grath was alive and unharmed, that he had been treated according to the terms outlined in interspecies detention agreements, and that he would be returned when Earth Command had completed its review. The Vrethkai delegate asked for a specific timeline. I said that Earth Command would provide one when it had one. Cole stared at me. He had the look of someone working out how to push without knowing where the resistance was going to come from. I did not help him find out. The session ended 2 hours later without any formal resolution, which was itself a resolution of a kind. No censure of human action. No demand for reparations. A motion to establish a Fringe Operations Review Committee, which passed with 7 votes, and whose terms of reference were worded so carefully that they did not actually require any party to do anything. After the session ended, Alan Price and I walked through the council building's exterior corridor toward our transit point. One of the junior representatives from a species called the Sarati fell in a step beside us and said, in the careful way that junior diplomats say things they have been told to say, but have been given latitude in the timing of, that his government wished us to know that they had always valued their relationship with humanity and looked forward to continuing it. Alan Price thanked him. I said nothing. They expected fury. They expected demands. What they got was paperwork, and somehow that frightened them more. The relay station looked the same when I returned to it. It was always going to look the same. It was a small outpost at the edge of a quiet part of the fringe, and the fact that the galaxy had redistributed itself somewhat over the past 3 months had not changed the physical appearance of the operations room, or the quality of the coffee, or the way the star map on the wall caught the light at certain hours. My 3 colleagues had been replaced by a new rotation of 4 people, one of whom I recognized from a previous assignment, and who greeted me with the cheerful confusion of someone who had not been following current events closely enough to understand why I had returned at all. I told her it was complicated and made 2 cups of coffee. Grath had been returned to the Vrethkai 10 days after the council session. I had not been present for the transfer. Alan Price had managed it, and the official record of the handover was 3 lines long. Grath was alive. He was in good health. He had been transported to Vrethkai diplomatic personnel at the agreed coordinates. He had not said anything when he left. Not to the guards who accompanied him, not to the transfer team, not to anyone. I did not know if this was pride or understanding or something else entirely, and I found that I did not particularly need to know. He was gone. The record was complete. The Vrethkai had not retaliated. I had wondered about this. In the weeks after the fringe operations, I had read Vrethkai military communication as closely as I had ever read anything, looking for the signs of preparation that would indicate a second wave, a counter-response, some escalation designed to recover what they had lost. What I found instead was a gradual and apparently deliberate contraction. Patrol routes that had been pushing outward for months began to pull back. Supply operations that had been extending into new corridors returned to established paths. They had not issued any public statement about the fringe. They had not held a press event or released a council document or made any diplomatic overture that could be read as an acknowledgement of what had happened. They had simply stopped. Every operation, every route extension, every incursion into corridors that bordered human traffic zones. Stopped, quietly, without explanation. On the 9th day after my return to the station, a message arrived for me through the personal diplomatic channel. It was not on official Vrethkai letterhead. It did not carry any government identifier. The sender was listed only as Sarah, which was enough. It was a single question. She asked, "Did Earth plan this from the beginning, from the moment of the first attack, or did you improvise as you went?" I sat with that question for 2 hours. It was an honest question. It was the question of someone who had been operating on an incorrect model and had identified the specific point where her model had broken down. She was not asking because she was angry or because she wanted ammunition. She was asking because she needed to understand, and understanding was the only thing that could actually prevent this from happening again. I wrote back one word. Yes. I did not elaborate. The elaboration would not have added anything. What I meant was, yes, Earth planned this from the moment of the first attack. Yes, the 6 weeks of silence were not hesitation. Yes, the 17 ships were already moving before Grath sent Sarah to offer us a trade framework that included the territory where our people had died. Yes, we had counted all 73 targets before we answered. Yes, she did not reply after that. I did not expect her to. In the second week, the trade agreements began arriving. 3 of them from 3 separate species, all proposing expanded commercial frameworks with human operators in the outer routes. 2 of the 3 had, prior to the fringe operations, maintained formal trade agreements exclusively with Vrethkai-aligned entities in that region. They had not announced any change in their alignments. They had simply redirected their paperwork toward Earth in a quiet way that diplomatic relationships are restructured when the calculation underlying them has shifted. I filed the agreements with the appropriate Earth Command Office and noted the senders in my log. The Thalvry representative sent a personal communique 3 weeks after the council session. It was addressed to me by name, which was unusual for a correspondence of that formal seniority, and it was longer than I expected. She wrote about the history of Rule 1 in more detail than had been available in the archive, about the debates within the original Thalvry Council delegation over how to word it, about the arguments some members had made that it was condescending to frame a warning as a rule rather than a treaty, and the counter-argument that what had happened at Stardate Reference 774 Alpha was precisely not the kind of thing that belonged inside a treaty. At the end of the communique, she wrote, "The rule has been re-archived and formally recirculated to all current council members, with updated language and an expanded historical appendix. A footnote has been added to the original text. It reads, as of this star date, the rule remains in effect. It has been tested once. It held. I read that footnote several times. It held. I thought about what holding meant. I thought about the 17 ships in the fringe, about the timing windows and the 73 simultaneous targets, about Alan Price and his extraordinary stillness in every room I had ever watched him occupy. I thought about Sarah's shuttle detaching from the Resolute and moving back into open space with an offer that had not been accepted, and the look on her face that I had not been able to read because she was practiced enough that her face rarely said what she was actually thinking. I thought about Owen Banks and Louise Ferry. I sat in the operations room, alone, the same way I had been alone on the night the Argent Cross's signal came in, and I said their names out loud. Not for any formal reason, not for the record, just because it seemed like the right thing to do in a space where no one was listening except the star map and the cold equipment light. On the 41st day of my return, an alert came through the station's monitoring system. A minor species called the Revthi, based near the outer edge of the fringe's eastern boundary, had filed a formal border complaint against a human survey team operating in Corridor 77. The complaint was detailed and appeared to have been written by someone who believed they were entitled to the corridor in question and expected their claim to be taken seriously. I pulled the Earth Command automated response that had already been generated and queued for delivery. It was polite. It was firm. It acknowledged the Revthi's claim and explained, in clear language, that Corridor 77 fell within the Human Survey licensing area registered with the Galactic Council. It noted the Human Survey team's operational rights understanding agreements. It attached, as a reference document, a copy of Rule 1 with the updated historical appendix and the Thalvery footnote. The Revthi withdrew the complaint 47 minutes later. I made coffee and watched the star map and thought about the 61 hours before the timing window and Sarah asking how long and Alan Price looking at his watch. I hoped Rule 1 held. Not because I was afraid of what would happen if it did not. I was not afraid. I had read enough history to understand what happened when it did not, and I had watched 17 ships work in silence across 6 light years of space, and I had stood in the council chamber and read 312 names in 14 minutes, and I understood, in a way I had not understood 11 months ago when I was counting days on a quiet posting at the edge of nowhere, exactly what we were and what we were